As we're getting set up, I'm curious, how many of you work for someone else? There are a handful of CEOs maybe in this room, a couple. Business owners, individual proprietors, few, okay. Cool. Everybody that works for somebody has something in common. Everybody that works for somebody has probably a group of people that you're responsible to make commitments to. Your CEO, in fact, at pretty much every company here, it doesn't matter what business you're in, doesn't matter what industry you're in, have made 3 priorities, 3 commitments to the board, almost universally. Everybody has a pretty good idea what those 3 commitments are, right? Think about those objectives that you set at the end of 2014 that you're now marching against as an organization. There's 3 commitments universally are pretty much this. First, your CEO and the organization's tasked with growing top-line revenue. And that makes sense, right? Like CEOs start companies, join companies, and one of their key objectives is to grow top-line revenue. This is probably one of their favorite ones. I'll get back to that in a second. The second objective they have is to manage the company, manage the business with fiduciary responsibility. This also makes sense, right? It's logical, and there's a pattern to it. If you're in an organization, you hire a CFO, a head of finance, and that head of finance or that CFO puts checks and balances in place, and those checks and balances make sure that you manage to profitability. If you're a business that runs to profitability, you have a specific burn rate that you have to run to, but they manage that business. It's a playbook that makes sense there. The third objective priority that your CEO is committed to your board is to innovate for competitive differentiation. And this one's a little bit different, right? There's a lot of startups here, and San Francisco's a little bit unique culturally, so we think about this a little bit differently. However, most organizations think about building competitive differentiation with product by a really interesting playbook. That's hire a great product person and hope to hell that they figure out something that will be the next big product that'll help propel the company to success. So why is this interesting, or why is this important, and what's the relationship to Agile? Over the course of the next, let's call it 35, 40 minutes, I'm gonna hit 3 kind of major topical areas. The first is, I wanna give you some context around the way that businesses are built, and some context around the way that the patterns that we've introduced into companies have really evolved to what they are today. The context is really heavily built around how CEOs think about the organizational design, and what their experiences have been. The second area we'll talk about is the history of Agile, kind of why Agile got its roots in software development, where it came from, kind of what technological changes actually pushed it forward, its adoption rate today, and then we'll relate that into marketing, because I think it's really important to understand the context of where Agile has come from as it relates to our businesses. We'll call it software kind of more broadly for today. And then we'll end on what I consider to be a pretty important toolkit, a toolkit that will help us all think about the philosophical decisions that we need to have being made every single day that will help our organization use the tools to truly be agile, to use the systems that our engineering brethren have used. So let's get back to our CEO. Our CEO has made these 3 commitments. And our CEO has made these 3 commitments, and I made that comment. I said, your CEO probably is most comfortable with top-line growth. Right? And why is that? Well, there's a professor out at university. He's an econometrics professor. His name's Richard Foster, and he did a study. His study looked at the S&P 500. Is everybody familiar with the S&P 500 for the most part? We've got our 401ks. They're all doing awesome this year, which is fantastic. Richard Foster looked at the S&P 500 because he cared about the longevity of businesses that made it onto the S&P 500. Why? Because the patterns that these companies introduced helped them be successful, and the duration of time that they were successful and tracked on this indice should have a pretty high predictive indicator of the types of organizational structures and different tools that any other company should use. So when Richard Foster looked at the S&P 500, he first looked back in the early 1900s. He looked back around 1912, 1915, and he took the group of companies that were listed in the S&P 500, and he did an averaging out of the amount of time that those companies, once they made it to success, kind of being listed in the S&P 500, the amount of time that they were actually listed in the S&P 500. Anybody here to venture to guess how many years a company, once they made it on the S&P 500, stayed on the S&P 500? 70 and 10. So pretty wide variance there, right? Both good guesses. 72. Just damn good. You would win a t-shirt if I had one, but I don't. So what's this tell us? So at the turn of the century, in the 1900s, as companies started to grow to success, and we saw growth in companies, have them listed on this kind of magnificent indice for tracking the most successful companies in the world, there's one commonality that they all had. They were all fantastic at selling the products that they made. It didn't really matter what industry they're in, but they knew how to sell. But what's the thing that we learn as we think about organizational design? Because companies that were successful knew how to sell. We knew that when we thought about leadership, when we created a company, when we hired people in, when we put processes in, we needed to look patterns of success to pick the people that we wanted to hire. Probably not surprising that many of you who have been working in business, let's say call it for the last 15 years, you've probably worked for at least one CEO who came from the sales organization, who grew from the sales organization. And that's not because that person is absolutely the best qualified person. It's because the pattern for success that the investors, that the board, that the other people that were on the management team were looking for was to try and emulate this pattern of success that we have seen since the early 1900s. The same guy, Richard Foster, went back to organizations that were on the S&P 500. He took a look again at 2013 and 2014. Anybody care to guess how many years a company, if they're listed on the S&P 500, stays in the S&P 500? 17 years. 3/4 of a century, half a century, we've got almost 45 years of time completely wiped away for companies that are considered to be the most successful companies in the world, continuing to be considered the most successful companies in the world. That's pretty profound. When you think about the way that organizations have changed or really haven't changed, you have to ask the question, where do they find the leaders? What are the systems and processes they put in place? The same guy, Richard Foster, goes on to hypothesize that by 2020, 3/4 of companies that will be listed on the S&P 500, this is 5 years from now, we'll see if this guy's right or not, 5 years from now, 3/4 of the companies that will be in the S&P 500 will not be there today, or are not there today. But what do we have to think about? We work in an environment where we see a tremendous amount of change because technology is helping organizations create better products for customers. They're doing that because they found new ways to productize their organizations, create products that introduce what their value is to customers faster, that give better value to customers, that iterate when customers tell them or show them things that aren't working or are working. The product organizations and the processes for product organizations probably are not terribly surprising to all of us as those that are considered to be most valuable as we look forward. From Amazon to Uber, organizations operate differently. They operate differently because that person that's in the top spot thinks about the way that the company is run differently. They're not tied to 75 years of tradition and history to think about the way that a company should be run. What's all this have to do with Agile? Well, I worked at Microsoft in the early aughts, so from 2001 to about 2006. And that time at Microsoft was a pretty interesting time for me. I came from Yahoo. I really didn't understand what software was. I didn't get the idea that you had to make software, put it onto a golden disk, and then deliver it out to a Best Buy. It just didn't really make any sense to me. When I was there, two of my colleagues and I introduced the idea that you could actually sell software digitally and that you could do it directly. And this is on behalf of a company that had been 35 years selling through channel. And so what we created while we were at Microsoft is now what is Microsoft Store. It first started as an electronic software distribution platform. Why is this relevant and important for this discussion? Well, when we were building this team, I was the person that was the lone non-technical person in the organization. But I had worked in product, and I saw the way the product teams were working. And the way that the product teams were working, although they didn't have a formal language around it, was really what we understand to be Agile today. And what was most interesting for me as the person that was not in engineering is that when we would hire engineers from across Microsoft, these people that had been at the company for 20 some odd years, they would join our team and they would fail. And they wouldn't fail because they weren't amazing engineers. They wouldn't fail because they weren't great people. They would fail because the processes that we were using were so foreign to them, it took them many months to adapt to. So being a person that was not technically a marketer, but being responsible for a marketing team, I frankly didn't know any better. And I started to pull a lot of the tools that I saw these engineering teams use, these product teams use that happened to be Scrum back in that time frame, and applied them into the marketing organization. In the background, there's this video running. It's the kind of World Trade Center. It's the spire being placed on the top of it. I am scared to death of heights. And it's not like funny scared, ha. Like if I get up in anything that's heights, if I walk up these stairs and I look the wrong direction, I just absolutely freeze. Absolutely and totally freeze. And there's nothing that I can do about it. I'm a relatively rational person. So here I am back in 2001. I start pulling all these tools in from the engineering organization, and it was a pretty happy time for the company. We were growing. This product was evolving. I left Microsoft. I joined another company. We were growing. Lots and lots of growth time. And so the experimentation phase for me, this idea that you could use Agile processes directly into marketing, continued to be an area that I was investing in. But it was all happy time. It was peacetime. It was growth time. About 2.5 years ago, I joined an organization that was going through tremendous change, like absolutely tremendous change. Huge amounts of pressure, not the kind of pressure that's like, hey, if we don't do the things that we need to do this quarter, we'll figure it out the next quarter. It was like, if you didn't fix it right now, we're not going to make it past next quarter. If we don't get funding right now, we're not going to make it to the next quarter. So I got to this point where I had found myself having invested in organizations that were using Agile techniques, call it marketing, Agile marketing, call it iterative marketing, call it a lot of different things. We've been investing for several years, and I got to a point where I froze. I was at the top of the spire. I had absolutely no idea if where I had got myself, I'd be able to get back down, or if the teams that I was working with could actually be successful. It's interesting when we think about the concepts in Agile, because the concepts in Agile are generally speaking taught around this concept of peacetime. I don't know, how many of you read Ben Horowitz's most recent book, Hard Thing About Hard Things? I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite books. He wrote a bunch of blog posts and then put it together into this book along with a central narrative to it. But one of the key blog posts that he'd written, I think a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, is this one that talks about the CEO and the difference in a CEO between peacetime and wartime. And granted, this is hyperbolic, but I think it's particularly important in the context for today's discussions that I'm going to present with you or to you some of the history of why Agile is taking off, I think, the technological changes. But the context of the toolkit that I want to share with you is actually within this context, because Agile, in a lot of our businesses, has nothing to do with just trying to grow the business and be innovative. It has a lot to do with how do I deliver exactly what I need right now. And I think in marketing in particular, a little bit different than product, we have to be more prescriptive. So I'll give you a juxtaposition of these kind of core tools in the toolkit and how we would use them between peacetime and wartime. But let's talk about why Agile moved into the engineering department in the first place. So the Agile systems themselves have their roots in manufacturing, not kind of automobile manufacturing, although Lean does, but manufacturing, construction manufacturing. You think about building this building. So we've got 7 stories in this building. This basement floor height is a certain height. There are support beams. These are necessary because of the weight of the walls. The building process for building this building was very prescriptive. You had to get the right answer so that the building didn't crumble. The presupposition that you knew the right answer, that you did the math behind it, was always there. And that makes a ton of sense when you have to sequentially line up resources to build something. It makes tons of sense. In 1956, at a hardware symposium, it was in the Midwest, the first notion of waterfall was introduced into the software world. It was a hardware symposium where hardware developers were talking about how they had adapted this manufacturing process for building buildings directly into building hardware. And software developers at this point were kind of the subordinate teams to the hardware teams. So they introduced this process of waterfall, and what's fascinating is that from 1956, when it was introduced and started to be used, up until really over the last 7 or 8 years, the waterfall methodology, this presupposition that you knew the right answer, was the only way that software companies built software. The only way, for a half a century. During peacetime, organizations were looking for new ways to create new business processes that help them grow, to be more innovative, to find new ways to get people in the organization to work better together. But it was absolutely peacetime. There's an interesting part of the waterfall process that at least I found somewhat ironic moving into a company like Microsoft, and that's that the end customer was actually always removed from the product and engineering teams. If you worked at Microsoft or any other company that used the waterfall process and you worked in marketing, you were responsible for potentially doing some customer research. You became the voice of the customer. But your customer research wasn't lots and lots of statistically significant data. It was a handful of focus groups in a bunch of different cities around the US, potentially maybe around the world if you had a ton of money. The results that came out of it were then, on top of those results, impacted by whatever predisposition you had as the marketing person. You interpreted whatever you wanted to take away from focus groups, which are already highly interpretive. So the fascinating part about waterfall, although it did drive successful organizations for many, many years, that the customer was actually really never the customer. The customer was the marketing organization. The product team received from the marketing organization a product requirement stock, and they went away for a year, and they built it, and they came back, and they delivered it on a gold disc, and you put it into a box, and you sent it off to Circuit City, and you hope that Circuit City didn't go out of business. Some technological changes came along, and this happened in the late aughts, or the late 90s into the early aughts. The thing that we now call the cloud, this idea that there are stacks of servers that exist that are run by different companies that become a vehicle for deployment for software, really started to become popular when businesses started to make money on the internet. You think about AOL and Yahoo and Alta Vista, the companies that kind of pioneered the way that we make money on the internet today back in the late 90s. They also started to impact these big software companies that have been around for many decades at this point, that were making millions and millions of dollars. The most valuable company in the world other than GE was Microsoft for many years. And the cloud came along. And you had the ability as a developer to deliver your product not to a box on a disk in a Circuit City, but to deliver it directly to the cloud, or whatever it was called back then. Why is this interesting and relevant? Well, something pretty profound happened at the moment that they introduced their software directly onto the web. When they introduced it directly onto the web, data started to become available. Clickstream data, who used your product, what features work, what features didn't work, the fact that it was complicated to get started. All of these things started to show up in the form of data. Seems like that would be great, right? The customer, in theory, now has a voice directly to the organization that's building the product. This should have been fantastic. This should have been great. End of story. Everything's great. The problem is, for the past 50 plus years, these organizations had been browbeat and taught that there was only one way to build great software. It was using this waterfall process. This process that had a presupposition that you knew the right answer to build the right product for your customer. just a falsehood. Like we look at it today, we see and we hear about this process, and we're like, that seems so arcane. Why did that ever exist? Well, it worked really, really, really well until it didn't. When the web came along, when the cloud came along, and software started to be delivered directly to the web, challenges started to emerge. Challenges started to emerge impacting big organizations like Microsoft because they could deliver software to their customers that was better, and they delivered it faster. It became wartime for these big organizations, and in wartime, you have to make some pretty significant changes in the way that your company runs. About this time, 2001, 2, 3, and 4, the first group of developers and consultants met up in like a ski lodge, and I want to say it was in Idaho, something like that, 14 guys. What's that? Utah, Idaho. They sometimes blend together to me, even though they're not that close. So they met up together, and they wrote this thing that many of us probably have read or at least know about called the Agile Development Manifesto. And the Agile Development Manifesto, at least to me, is a pretty interesting document, kind of living environment or living place, in that if you really read it and spend some time with it or meet any of the people that were responsible for writing it, they'll tell you that it's not a religious doctrine. This isn't a prescription on the way that you have to work. It's a engagement toolkit for consultants and developers that were trying to figure out what are the right business processes and the right business tools to help them deal with this wartime change. And they wanted to get business for themselves. They were consultants. What we understand today to be Agile oftentimes takes the form of either Scrum or Kanban or Scrumban, or there's a bunch of different variations. And I'll tell you that pretty much every trainer that I've met or certifier in Agile will tell you that there is an absolute right way to do it. But when you talk to the guys that wrote the Agile Development Manifesto, they'll tell you that there actually was never intended to be a right way to do it. It's just the way that we've chosen to look at it over time. That's all cool, right? Well, engineering. You see, engineering is forced to change. They turn into wartime because there's a new technology that allows for them to deliver software differently and that helps them interface with customers in a very unique way. Forces them to change. It's wartime. They don't have a choice. What's happened to the rest of the company? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. The marketing organization happily plods along saying, you know what, I know the right answer. I know that if the color on the website is this, I know that if the brochure that I write has 4 paragraphs, I know that if I use this image of this person shaking this other person's hand, this is the right answer. We presupposed for many years, predates software engineering and the waterfall process. Marketing for centuries has said, we know what our customer wants. And we're gonna build it. And we're gonna line up resources sequentially, linearly, just like manufacturing. This is the way that marketing's worked. And when engineering was forced to change, when they changed into wartime and started to adapt to new processes and they started to introduce Agile into the systems, marketing just kept doing what we were doing. If we were lucky and we were working in this time period of change and our engineering team picked up these processes, what do we get to say? We got to say, our engineering team ships once a quarter, or they ship twice a year, or they ship 3 times a month. We got to say that we were faster, but we didn't change our processes at all. We really didn't have to. We didn't have to. Arguably, we do now. Not a technological change, not something as profound as the cloud being introduced directly to engineering teams where they can deploy their products. Something culturally significant happened. The popularization of social networks. Think of it as a change being driven not on technology, but on the backs of Dorsey and Zuckerberg. Started to really move into the popularity that they are today in the mid-aughts, 2005 and 6. So now we have organizations that are in wartime in the engineering teams that are finding new ways to build products, that are introducing them to their customers faster and better, that are starting to create some really innovative new products that are making customers happy, and marketing is just kind of plodding along until a fail point starts to happen. In the mid-2000s, 2005, 6, and 7, organizations kept doing what they were doing on the marketing communication side, and we have seen some of the most prolific fails in organizations because when they introduced what they presupposed to be the right answer, their customers revolted. It didn't matter that they created the right commercial to fit perfectly on a television show. It didn't matter if they created the right video to be a pre-roll on top of YouTube. It didn't matter because when their customers interacted with it and they didn't like it, they were able to have bidirectional communications with us in marketing. Technological change and cultural change have the same kinds of impacts. The same kind of impacts, and in our case, in marketing's case, our customer, again, becomes our customer. The same kind of prolific change the engineering teams had, I believe that marketing has gone through. We can't operate the same way that we have. The problem is we're still fishing for all of the right tools to be able to operate in a way that is similar to the way that our engineering teams work. Our waterfall processes, they don't work anymore in the same way. I'd argue that we now have moved ourselves as kind of a profession or a discipline within organizations into the beginning of an era that we can call kind of more broadly the Agile era. It's one that's not defined by a specific set of processes and tools that we absolutely have to use, but it's an understanding and appreciation that culturally things have changed with the way that customers interact with us. It's an appreciation that technology has changed the way that our product teams develop products, and that we have to find a nice way to marry those two things together. But I think the context that Agile is talked about most oftentimes is this idea that everything is peacetime, that organizations as they grow are always just thinking about innovation. And we know that's not true. If you're a company that's just taken seed funding, if you're an organization that's going through some significant change, you have real hardcore deliverables. And the ideas in Agile, for the most part, are intended to help everybody in the organization be a part of the process, push decision-making out to the fringes or out to the edges. But sometimes you have to think about how to balance that peacetime with wartime. I'm going to share with you 5 key tools that I believe are a part of a kind of toolkit, a philosophical toolkit to help you be successful in Agile. And I'm going to juxtapose those tools, kind of both my perspective on organizations and how those tools apply in peacetime as well as in wartime. There's a study that was done in 2004 at the University of Edmonton in Canada. The study was done with grade school age kids, 6, 7, and 8-year-olds. 6, 7, and 8-year-olds were given a picture book by this scientist. And in this picture book was a pretty simple story. And these kids were asked to tell the story that they saw in the picture. The story was pretty simple. It was a frog comes to a door, a frog opens a door, sits down at a chair, puts a napkin on his lap, picks up a fork, the waiter comes, he orders his food, the waiter goes away, comes back, and gets his food. When she asked the kids in the class to tell the story that they saw in the pictures, everybody in the class was able to do it. Everybody in the study was able to do it. Not super exciting. But the reason that she was doing this study was actually to find the correlational relationship between studying, or between what they study and where their aptitudes are and their ability to tell stories. What's fascinating about this is that when she went back to these same kids and she asked them to tell the story from a different perspective, the majority of the kids in the study actually couldn't do it. So 25 kids that are in the study, more than half of them actually couldn't understand how to tell a story that they were looking at in pictures from a different perspective. But some of those kids could. So one of the kids told the story from the perspective of the fork, another one told the story from the perspective of the waiter. And when she started to look at these particular kids, the ones that I think we could all consider to be the best storytellers in the class, or in this study, something I think kind of interesting came from it. The correlational relationship to the areas that they had the best aptitude in. Anybody care to guess kind of what those are or what those could be? Would it be writing or spelling? I would assume that somebody's a good storyteller was a speller. The first time that I read this study, that's what I thought. Well, these kids are going to be good in grammar. Right? That makes a ton of sense. In fact, that's not true. It's a rhetorical question, sort of. Every kid that was able to tell a strong story had the highest marks in math across the board, every single one of them. And it's an interesting thing to think about because the world that we live in Agile, one of the key kind of tenets of the Agile world is that you have access to data. Right? Technological changes changed the way that product teams had access to customer data. Our interactions with our customers changed the way that we have access to data. Our ability to tell strong stories based on the data that we have available. We saw Paul come up here and talk about hypotheses. Right? The context for everything that he's talking about is the most critical part of that story. The data helps him answer the questions that he has. Storytelling and math have an incredibly strong relationship into the Agile system. And in peacetime, the way that the teams think about using storytelling and think about using math in particular is to actually use it as an influence tool. We think of these concepts like user stories. We develop the things that we want to build as an organization, as a team. And we don't tell people what to do. We influence them. And the way that we influence them is that we use the math to do it, to influence. But influencing works incredibly well when you're trying to find new ideas, when you're trying to create innovations within the organization, when you're just trying to do what you think is next. Things are very different when you're in an organization that you have very specific objectives, maybe they're revenue objectives. And in the context of storytelling, math sets the priorities in wartime. It's not a nuance, it's actually a pretty huge chasm between those two, being influential with math and telling people what has to happen because of math. When you think about the context of your team, if you're trying to deploy Agile, if you have deployed Agile, and you're in an environment where you're really being driven to hit a specific objective in a time frame, and your lives depend on it professionally, math becomes one of the most fantastic tools to get rid of all the rest of the noise. To very specifically say, here are the things that we have to do, and here is the intended outcome for it, and this is why we're doing it, end of story. It flies a little bit in the face of some of the Agile concepts, right? Being overly communicative with people, trying to get consensus. But the reality is, not all environments allow for us to do that. And I think it's an important context to take away from at least this talk tonight. You have to be directive. You can still use these systems even when you're being directive. Has anybody read any of the Jason Fried books? Rework, one of my favorites for Rework. Another great book. So 2 book recommendations thus far. Hard Thing About Hard Things and Rework, if you haven't read it. Jason Fried and his team built 37 Signals. 37 Signals built Basecamp and a bunch of other products. Cool team, right? Conceptually, cool team. Completely distributed, no kind of actual office. A couple dozen people work at the company now, mostly engineers, work completely in Agile. In the book Rework, one of the things they talk about is when you're trying to evaluate hiring somebody in the organization. And let's say you have 2 engineers that you're trying to hire, or 2 engineers of which you can only hire 1. And let's say that they test out to be, from an aptitude perspective, pretty complementary to each other or pretty similar to each other from a skills perspective. They use one particular screener to choose who they hire. That screener is who writes best. Who writes best? Now, who's the better engineer? They're both relatively comparable. Who writes best? One of the critical tools in the Agile world, in my opinion, is the ability to actually use literary techniques to help influence, right? Understanding storytelling, plot specifically, plot lines, knowing the 6 kind of major archetypal storylines that you can take somebody through. It's a critical learning tool for organizations because it helps you articulate the things that you're trying to accomplish much more effectively than just the brute force of telling somebody, here's exactly what I want to do. Understanding literary concepts like stories and plots are unbelievably important for marketing organizations, especially using Agile tools. The way that it shows up is practically in writing a user story. Has anybody here written a user story? Maybe for a marketing team, maybe for a product team. User stories are fundamentally simple, and they should always be about the user, right? That seems like it's pretty logical. What I've actually found is that in environments where it's healthy, where you're growing, where things in the organization aren't under massive pressure, just the normal kind of pressure that we deal with, a well-written user story should actually be about the user, written on behalf of the user, for the user. But things change when you're in an organization where you actually have to drive to a specific set of results, and you don't have a choice but to do that. What I found to be most successful in an organization is changing the user away from the user back into the business. The intent of this particular action is to drive this response to give the company this type of financial gain. Again, not a concept that I think everybody that uses Agile would particularly love because it does fly a bit in the face of the way that it works, but I'll tell you that you can use these systems, you can be effective in kind of wartime scenarios, and this is one of the best ways to do it. That user story is really about the way that the business needs to execute. Hypothesis testing. I'm okay at math. I'm not great at math. I'll tell you a little secret. I don't think you have to be unbelievable at math to be effective at hypothesis testing. I think Paul's description of getting to enough data to be confident and no more is the absolute right way to learn it. In fact, that's not the way that most people are taught hypothesis testing. Right? Come up with the different ideas that you want to test against, and then make sure you are statistically, positively at the point where you are 100% certain that the thing that you've done is correct and that what you are going to put out from a test into the world is going to be successful. The reality is that doesn't work. Just practically, it doesn't work. One of the contexts for kind of peacetime is that hypothesis creation should really be an infinite set of things that could support the business, and it's about creating a better user experience. How do you shorten the number of clicks in a particular experience? How do you make the sign-up process happen faster? How do you get people to share more? And the list can go on and on and on. Context here is that the hypothesis testing shouldn't be overblown. You're using math as a technique for storytelling, and hypothesis testing should fit into that. In an organization that's in peacetime, you ought to be thinking about hypotheses that you can disprove that come from anything that can make the business more successful. When you're in wartime, you have to link it directly to revenue. I don't say that and mean to be downtrodden, because I don't think it's a bad thing. But hypothesis testing to look at the impact on the revenue as opposed to maybe just clicks or maybe just the shortening of a particular experience or maybe the shortening of time for onboarding. All those things may be important for the business, but when you're in wartime, when you're developing hypotheses, it's not infinite anymore. It's very specifically linked to the way that the business is growing. And that's a nuance that if you talk to teams that are in marketing that are working on hypothesis creation and then ultimately running hypotheses that they're trying to disprove, what they'll tell you is they're kind of all over the map. If you're in wartime, you have to be incredibly focused. Just a couple more. Feedback to me is particularly important as a part of the kind of philosophical toolkit for Agile. The kind of atomic unit interactions in an organization that make up the culture, those interactions in my mind are feedback that we provide to each other. Right? If the atomic unit of the culture of your organization is the person and the group of people, the way that they interact, the health of your organization is dictated by the quality of the feedback that people provide to each other. I'm pretty sure that most of you here that are in marketing have probably had this meeting before. You sit down with the person in sales that you work with, you sit down with the head of engineering, they say whatever you just did, or they're giving you feedback on whatever you just did, and the way that they deliver it is like this. That is a piece of shit. Okay, I hear you. What can I do about it? How would this make it work for you better? How can we make it work for you better? I don't care. It's horrible. Just give me something different. That kind of feedback is unfortunately not just commonplace from other organizations into marketing. It's actually really common inside of marketing. I think marketing does two things particularly poorly because our skill sets haven't really been built up around it. The first is that we provide unbelievably poor feedback to each other. Kind of communications in marketing organizations are generally below par, or what we should have them be, especially the focus that we have outside the company. The second thing that we do, I think particularly poorly, is we manage our time poorly. Right? We can't estimate the amount of time it's going to take us to do things. The agile systems in the engineering world, I think, provide one of the most fantastic sets of tools to drive better communication, which is built on solid feedback. Not every organization uses pair programming, but if a company is using pair programming, think about the intimacy of that. You've got two people that are physically sitting next to each other. They're looking over each other's back. And if I do something, I write something, and the person that I'm paired with says, that is the most ridiculous memory hogging thing that you could have ever possibly done, and you're an idiot, and I'm going to jump in and fix that. It never happens like that. Right? Feedback comes in those situations in a way that shows up as positive feedback, as encouraging feedback, suggestive feedback. In fact, the entire sets of agile systems, if you're using Scrum or Kanban, are built around meetings that are intended to provide really positive feedback. I have a stand-up. In my stand-up, I talk about what I'm doing. I talk about the blockers that I have. We interact with each other to get and deliver feedback. It sounds so simple. And in fact, that's one of the things that I appreciate most about the agile systems as you apply them into marketing, is that they provide the footprint in the organization and the tools to deliver great feedback to each other, to communicate with each other better, more effectively. But things are a little bit different in peacetime than they are to wartime. When you deliver feedback, describe, analyze, evaluate. I'm sure many people have seen kind of these three principles of delivering great feedback. We won't go into a ton of detail here because I think what's really critical is that in the agile system, when you are prioritizing the work that you're working on and you have a specific objective that you have to get to because your company depends upon it, feedback changes. It has to be incredibly direct. And one of the words that you generally don't use in the agile system is to be prescriptive. But in fact, delivering feedback that is prescriptive is one of the best tools to use if you have to get results. It isn't about just coaching somebody along. It's about making sure that they understand exactly the feedback that you have, why you need to see something change if you need to see it changed, and how you expect it to change. Right? The rest of the tools and the systems all work together, but you have to be prescriptive. And it's a very significant change from the peacetime environment in the agile system. Last tool, last big tool in the toolkit is the idea of the backlog. All of us have been in every organization at some point in time finding ourselves with a gigantic chasm between the strategy that is espoused from our CEO and potentially our board and the executive team and what we're actually working on. The disconnection between the things that we say are important and the actual things that we're working on happens incredibly quickly. And it mostly happens incredibly quickly because we don't have a great clearinghouse for the things that we're working on. I take my fiefdom, I go off into my corner, I work on the things that I think are important because I've interpreted what our strategy is, and I've interpreted how my team can execute against that. The backlog in the agile system and the clearinghouse of all the different backlogs that are being worked on is the most fantastic and simple tool that you can put into place in an organization that helps you see whether or not the strategy that you have espoused as an organization actually relates to the things that you're working on. But that backlog needs to look a little bit different. The prioritization of the backlog needs to look a little bit different from peacetime to wartime. Is everybody familiar with the concept of a durable team? Got a group of people, cross-functional, that are working on a specific project. It's one of the tenets, one of the key tools in the agile system if you're practically implementing it. In the durable team, there's a product owner. The product owner is somebody in the organization who's responsible for making sure that those users, those customers, are happy with the work that's being done, right? Those user stories are being accepted properly. One of the main ideas in Agile is that the product owner is the end person that makes the decision on what makes it above the line and below the line. That one person in the organization. One of the challenges that I've seen is that when you're in peacetime, actually this is a good thing in peacetime, one of the things that happens in peacetime is that the product owners actually get pushed out into the organization. It may be somebody who is a product manager in the marketing organization that becomes the product owner. Maybe an individual contributor product manager as an example. But more often than not, the product owner is not somebody inside of a marketing organization that has a purview that's greater than their team. And that becomes a problem when you're working in a wartime situation. And this is actually one of the most critical learnings that I feel like I've had with the teams that I've worked with for the last couple of years. It's that when you're organizing a team, durable teams in particular, and you're developing your backlog, and then you're prioritizing these user stories in the backlog, if you are in an organization that is working in a wartime scenario, it is unbelievably critical to make sure that the person who's your product owner has the widest purview across activities in the company as possible. Sounds maybe sort of logical, right? If you're making a decision on the priorities that are going to impact the potential for your company to be successful, the person that's making that above the line, below the line cut for the work that's happening, they better know how everything in the rest of the business is working. Not just what's happening in marketing, but how the sales organization is doing, what's going on in the communications team, what's happening in the product organization. Is this product going to slip? Is it not? You have to have a wide purview to make the most informed decision. And this simple switch of taking kind of leadership team in a marketing organization, those that have the widest purview, and placing them as the responsible parties of the product owners, has made some of the most significant changes in the work that we do and our ability to impact the business in a very significant way in short periods of time. So just a couple takeaways, and then we can do a QA if we want. The first is that even though I shared kind of concepts around kind of high-level concepts, philosophies, and we didn't really get into any of the details of the tactics. So we can talk about tactics, but I'll tell you that my experience both working in companies that are healthy and growing and trying to innovate, kind of that peacetime, and companies that are really trying to change and under a tremendous amount of pressure, wartime, the agile systems have worked equally well in both cases. It doesn't matter if your company's healthy, it doesn't matter if your company's changing, it doesn't matter if you're in a seed stage. If you commit to the system, you will find a way for the system to help you communicate better. Second is that the system itself fundamentally creates a better environment for communication. The difference between peacetime and wartime on the communication side is that in peacetime, you really do push innovations out into the organization. You allow for completely autonomous work to happen in each of the different groups. In wartime, although you have durable teams that are built on cross-functional groups or built from cross-functional groups across your marketing team, it is unbelievably important to have a balance with top-down decision-making. And that balance is a kind of a fine balance that you've got to find within your organization, but it is critical to set out to do that at the upfront as opposed to find your way there over time. And the last is that the person or the persons with the widest purview, they're the ones that are going to have the biggest and most positive impacts for you. Right? You may have a functional specialist that's been working in Agile and understands all the systems, but they may not have the widest purview. They're not going to be the right person for you to choose to actually operate a product or a specific durable team in a wartime scenario. So for me personally, the experience of the last several years have been pretty wonderful. These tools I'm completely committed to as a head of a marketing organization. And I found that it helps me and the teams that I work with do a couple things that I find particularly unique. There are a handful of people that I've had a chance to work with that are actually here today. And I'll say that the commonality of the people that I've worked with in different organizations has a much higher likelihood to be there now that we use these systems than that chance occasion where you have a wonderful team that's just super magical and the teams are growing. So I believe very strongly that these systems, these agile systems, create a better environment to have longer lasting relationships, along with doing really highly quality work on behalf of your company. I don't believe that it's just purely by hiring people and by being lucky about hiring great people, although that happens on occasion. It really is when you make an investment in the system, you find a way as a team to communicate better with each other. When you find a way to communicate better with each other, find a way to have a relationship that spans outside of just the office. And I think that's an incredibly important outcome of using this system that probably isn't talked about as much as it needs to. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. I think I probably went over a little bit of time. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer some.
So if anyone's got any questions, please come over here and line up, and we'll go through them in order. First in, first...
Oh, the pressure of standing up and asking questions.
Come over here, boss. Oh, we've already got one.
Oh, that's a question. Yeah, when you're managing, so I think one of the advantages of Agile is it allows very good local communication.
Yes.
You're all focused on the same data and you're all working together, and so you don't need long-term planning. When you're talking about wartime and you need to have central control, which is focused on and identifying and communicating your central problems that are going to kill you, whatever that was that Ben Horowitz talked about. How do you facilitate the same level of quality of communication that you can get locally in an Agile group, pair programming, or a Scrum team or whatever, when you have to have one executive or a small group of executives speaking with a large non-local group like 37 students all over the world, and they're in different places, and they have different information in front of you? What is your key facilitating that, especially when you have very little time, you're more? Like, what's the key?
So a couple comments. The first is that I actually don't believe that it is an outcome or a byproduct of the Agile system is that you don't have to do long-term planning. I actually think that planning is unbelievably important no matter what organization, no matter what systems you're in. So we do a planning cycle as an organization. We do it together. That's a critical piece for us. We've introduced, so we're in an organization right now that is kind of at the cusp of being in wartime. Put it there. And the communication tools that we've used, we've introduced, they're, I think, new. I'm not sure that everybody else uses them. Maybe people do. But we do a 2-week sprints for the durable teams, and then we do a planned spike week. So we're technically in a 3-week cycle. That planned spike week is our way to increase the communications across the group. The 3 meetings that we've introduced into the group, into our whole company, that help us deal with exactly what you're talking about. The first is what we call an acceptance meeting. An acceptance meeting exists in the Agile world, but it happens locally. To your point. We take the entire organization of marketing, so we've got 25 people that are there. The first day, we have the product owners meet for 2 hours with the entire organization and walk through all the user stories. So everybody has the context around all the work that's happening. And that meeting with everybody's involvement, although it is an investment in time, a couple of hours from 25 or so people, is an unbelievably important meeting because it provides that band of context that you don't generally get. The second meeting that we have is a kind of a resource realization meeting. Even though each one of the durable teams have said, here's my above the line, below the line for the user stories for this week, the second meeting we have is with the teams that have central resources, your design teams, your web development teams. We go back with the product owners, and we make absolutely sure that we've got the ability to forecast the amount of time it's going to take to do all these user stories. We revalidate everything that's been accepted. So we've got one level of acceptance and kind of context for the entire organization, a second one that is a revalidation with the people that are going to do a lot of the work that are potentially going to share resources across different teams. And the third meeting that we have is what we call a share day, kind of our version of a share day. And that version of a share day is that all of the user stories that have been executed against, the data that's available from them, kind of their success or failures, we get back up in front of the entire organization, and over the course we do a thing called Thirsty Thursdays, so we have drinks Thursday afternoon from 4:30 until 5:30, and during that time while we're having drinks, each one of the product owners get up, walk through each one of the user stories that's executed against, share that context about what has and hasn't worked. So it's both a practical tool to share context, but also an emotional tool to show what has worked and how we can reinforce those things happening again. It's a set of tools that we use that are a bunch of meetings.
That's like the spike week, a lot of places. Yeah, that spike week or that intermediate week can be a hack week for the engineering team, but while the managers go and perform that non-local communication. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
So, very good talk. Thank you. The Agile developed in the development engineering world, gone across into the marketing world. Have you seen it applied in sales? Do salespeople learn and improve?
Can salespeople learn and improve? Sure, of course they can.
Have you ever seen it?
Absolutely. So think about it as a push-pull relationship, right? Marketing and sales organizations, because of the objectives they had and sometimes the misalignment for them and the measurements for the two different organizations, have oftentimes had friction, right? Most organizations that are B2B have that friction at some point or another. Friction comes because you set expectations incorrectly, right? Or you set them poorly, typically. Not you specifically, but they are set poorly.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe, I don't know. In the Agile system, just the tool, the backlog, and working with a sales organization, independent of whatever processes they use, because they're fairly dictatorial, top-down driven, they've got processes they follow, just purely exposing the backlog of the work items that are being agreed to be kind of prioritized is one of the critical tools. So critical tools to help drive better success with this team. So one, I've never seen a sales organization adopt Agile, but the tools that the marketing team introduces to them, specifically the stand-up and the backlog, are massively effective working with a sales organization.
Okay.
Because they do one thing better than anything else, they help you communicate priorities.
Okay.
Thank you for
Share day. Austin just said something I think is particularly important. The share day kind of concept we've been using in a couple of different companies for a while. That share day is a really good example, or a really good place to bring a sales organization to show them the amount of throughput that the marketing team has. There's a tendency, I think, that we all have that if we don't know exactly what somebody else is doing, we just assume that they're not doing anything. So if you're not talking to the sales organization every single day, they're probably going to assume that you're just not doing anything. But when you show the throughput, in addition to prioritize with them, a couple of good tools.
My question is a bit more practical. What kind of tools would you recommend, let's say, for small organizations actually to use in order to apply Agile methodology?
Cool. So there are two tools that I like that we use in our team today. We've used a handful of different ones. We use Trello for all of our backlog organization, and we actually still use Mind Manager. I was at MindJet, fell in love with Mind Manager. It's my mapping tool. I think it's one of the best organization tools. to actually create kind of the product or the user stories and then reorganize kind of on the fly with them. If you don't know Mind Manager, it's a mind mapping tool.
I mean, is Trello enough to encourage, to ensure proper communication among everyone?
I find Trello to be enough, but the kind of pitfall with Trello is that it's really easy to not write out an actual user story that people understand if you're not standing with them. So the toolkit, in that toolkit that I described, actually being able to write well, understanding kind of characters and plots and kind of the narrative, like that is something that we have to continually reinforce. Like if we're rushed, if we're feeling an extra amount of stress on top of the normal stress that we feel, the first thing to fail is that we write poor user stories. And when we write poor user stories, Trello becomes just a complicated mess. So if you use Trello, you have to be very acutely aware that you need to keep the quality of the user stories up enough to where people understand them without you being there.
Thank you.
I think that's just a truism, right? Like, yeah. If you write poorly, period, people have no idea what you're talking about. Yeah.
So larger organizations come with a lot of inertia.
Mm-hmm.
How would you recommend generating the kind of buy-in that implementing a system like this would take?
I would say that every organization has inertia, right? And there's a gentleman that I worked with who is the CIO for Fireman's Fund and the CTO for Schwab. And I was doing some restructuring consulting work with him. And I was going into a big insurance company up in the Northwest. And right before I was starting the engagement, he pulls me aside and he's like, I have something to tell you. I think it's going to be important for you to know. Like, all right, tell me. So look, just expect that the inertia that exists in this organization is greater than anything you could ever possibly imagine. Just assume that out of the gate. And he went into a little bit more detail. He said, everybody in an organization is kind of there at the organization to do something that's personal, right? Like you're there working on something because you feel like potentially it's important or it's giving you a reward that's meaningful for you. And if you've been there for any amount of time and you found a way to get a reward that's meaningful for you, the probability that changing something is going to have an impact to that is high, right? Or it has the potential to be high. So in his mind, and this has kind of been the way that I've thought about it since then, in his mind, the only way to effectively change an organization is to show success. Because the lack of seeing success is the biggest hindrance for success in an organization. So the way that you can use the Agile systems as you roll them out to get buy-in is actually to use some of the tools that are really simple, like a stand-up, like a share day, and potentially start with a project or two that you have a high probability of success. And the kind of secret here is that any project that you start using the system, if it's the first project, because you are communicating better and more frequently, your probability for success is very high. But being public, using the tools like stand-ups, starting on a project that you have a high probability for success, and then having success with it is the first way to show people that that's the behavior that's going to reward them. And then you repeat it, and you repeat it, and you repeat it, and you repeat it. The alternative is that you hire an executive that has bought in the system, and they just come in and say, here's the thing that doesn't happen all the time.
Thank you. I was going to ask a very similar question to hers, but I guess I'd just follow up on hers. And how would you recommend, even within a department, within a company that has a little bit of inertia, of introducing some of these more agile tools to?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is you don't have to call them agile. So know that, right? There's a couple of tools I think are particularly valuable. Stand-up is a wonderful tool, just period. Like use it, doesn't matter what else you do, just use the stand-up. I always recommend picking a project that's cross-functional in a marketing team, which is not particularly difficult to find generally, right? So think about a demand generation campaign, think about an SEM campaign. There's something that you're doing that is cross-functional. Bring that team that's working cross-functional away from the work that they're working on, kind of highlight them, put them in a central location within the team. If you have a physical location, you put them in. Let them use the tools like the backlog and the board. Let them use the stand-up. Let them show the success to the team. And at the conclusion of that, start it all over again. Start with a small project. Start with a project that you've got a high probability for success. Make sure that it's cross-functional and show it off. Cool. I think everybody here, Sam, what did you say? You're hiring lots at Zendesk. It's an awesome company, but don't steal the drinks. And don't touch the moss wall. I am absolutely thrilled to be here tonight, so I really appreciate the opportunity to come back and talk about Agile. I love Zendesk. This is an unbelievably beautiful space, and thank you very much for hosting us. I appreciate it. I'll hang out for a little bit if anybody wants to chat also. Cool. Thanks.
Everybody, we can hang out for a little while, then we can't stay here. You don't have to go home. But I know a group of us are going to be going to McKellar If you were here in November, it was we all went over there. It's about a block down the street. Are you Nick? Raise your hand. Nick, who checked you in, is definitely going. So if you're don't want to walk through the Tenderloin alone or not sure where it is, find Nick and he'll lead you there.